Hi, Uniquely Cindy here. I hope that you have been enjoying the videos that I uploaded from Cades Cove of the churches and their cemeteries. I enjoyed doing the videos. I've enjoyed doing some research on the cemeteries, and I hope you've enjoyed them. I'm going to leave you with some information today about the custom of the cemeteries during the time period of the early Cades Cove. There was an unspoken rule during the time period of the early years of Cades Cove that Sunday all work ceased, and the community would come together and they would worship and they would pay honor to the Sabbath and they paid honor to their families. This was an unspoken rule. Didn't have to be written in stone. It's just something that the people done. Now, they continued meeting in house to house until around 1825, and John and Lucretia Oliver came together with the community and they formed a Baptist church there. And so that was one of the first churches, or the first church in the Cove was the Baptist, or today is known as the Primitive Baptist Church. The Cove was founded on a fundamental faith that we're going to live here on earth, we're going to die and be buried in our cemetery here at the church, and we're going to rise to a better place. So they had a fundamental faith. It didn't matter what religion they were, it didn't matter what denomination they were. The basic fundamental is we live, we do what we're supposed to do here on earth, we're going to die, we're going to be buried, and we're going to rise again. And that's a very basic and very awesome fundamental, because you do what you have to do. You live the way God commands you to live, and you honor God and you honor your family, and that meant a lot. Now, the custom of the day was when a person died, they would take and they would go to the church where the interment was going to take place. A neighbor, a family member would go to that church and they would ring a bell at that church, and that bell would ring for a few minutes and then it would stop. That was letting the community know that someone in their cove had passed away. Then the bell would start ringing again, and it would ring one time for every year of the individual's life that had passed away. If it was a 60-year-old person, it would ring 60 times. If it was a 5-year-old child, it would ring 5 times, letting the community know who had passed away and how old they were. The minute that bell ceased ringing, then the men would start coming from the fields or their homes, and they gathered at the church. The coffin maker would go and he would start gathering his supplies that was needed. If he did not have the lumber at his home to make the coffin, then he would go to a central location where the lumber was kept. Anytime a tree, and from what I was reading, it was a lot of times walnut wood, anytime a tree was cut down and not used for a home or a barn or something like that, then it was sliced up and boards was made out of it, and it's kept in a central location for the coffin maker. The men would go into the cemetery and start preparing the grave for the body that would soon join it. Coffin makers started working on the coffin that would soon join it. The women in the community would go to the house, because soon the coffin would arrive at the house, and they would line that coffin. Now, if the deceased was a female, the women in the community would wash and prepare the body for burial. If it was a male, then the men in the community would wash and prepare the body for burial. And then the family would just sit there with their neighbors and all until the coffin maker brought the coffin to the house. Once it arrived, the ladies would get together, they would line that coffin, and then they would put the individual into the coffin, and they did the next thing. The grave is by this time probably prepared, and everybody comes together and they do what we call today a wake. In the Cove, it was called sitting with the dead, but we call them wakes, and that's where somebody would sit up all night long with the body. The next morning, the body was then taken, put on a cart, carried to the prospective church where it was going to be interned. The body was carried to the front of the church. The coffin was open. When the coffin was open, people came in and they paid their last respects by walking past the coffin. There might have been some words said, there might have been a song sung, but after the respects were paid, Then the pallbearers would get the coffin and carry it out to the cemetery where the grave was already prepared by the men of the community, and then they would lower that coffin down into the grave by ropes. After the coffin was lowered and the ropes were pulled out, then the men would take and start shoveling the dirt back onto the grave. Now, once the dirt was shoveled on it, they mounded the grave, and they would pat that dirt down with their shovels and all. And then the women of the community, if it was in the fall or the winter, they had spent all night while sitting with the dead making paper flowers. And they would take those paper flowers and they would spread it over the top of that mounded dirt. If it was spring or summer, then they could use fresh flowers. But once again, if it's the fall or later the year, or they just hadn't had time to gather flowers, they made the paper flowers in the night and they would put them on the coffin the next morning. So the whole community came together to help this family that had lost a loved one and to give that strong feeling of community togetherness. It was a time of, we got your back. And I like that. After the funeral was over with, the respects had been paid, then work and whatever other activities was taking place resumed. Of course, the family, if they still needed anything or still needed to help, community would take care of that, but things went back to normal work activities at this time. What a lot of people don't understand, because today we can have a funeral that can take 3 weeks to actually bury an individual, or sometimes a month. Back then, you had 24 hours basically to do everything that needed to be done and get that body in the ground. So the community came together to help with the situation. And that's a wonderful time. You know, we don't have to do things like they did in the 1800s. Times have changed. We have modern conveniences. But I think that there's a community respect, a respect for each other that we need to put back into practice here today. The next time the Cove would come together, another big day, I should say, that they would come together that dealt with the cemeteries was on Decoration Day, which usually took place on the last Sunday of May. And what they would do is they'd get together as a community once again. The Saturday before, they would be cooking, they would be preparing, they would be getting paper flowers made again, they'd be cooking chicken and potatoes or whatever it is that they were going to cook for the picnic. And they'd get up early that Sunday morning and they'd go to the first church. And when they'd get to that first church, they'd go in and they'd have a service. They'd have a song or two, they'd have sermons preached on respecting the families. They would also have maybe family members come up and speak about their families that was buried in that cemetery. And then as a group, they would go out into the cemetery and they'd clean up all of the graves. Then they would leave there and go to the next church, and the process was repeated. After the second service, about this time, it's about noontime, a little later, maybe a little earlier, but at that time they would get together and they would take the next 2.5 hours and have a huge social lunch together. And the families all brought food, they fellowshipped, they talked, they shared communion together and had a good time. Then they would go to the last church, which was usually the Primitive Baptist Church, and when they got there, the process repeated again. So it was a huge day of celebrating their families, celebrating their loved ones, celebrating God, cleaning up their community, cleaning up the cemeteries, and honoring each other. It was a big social event of the Cove. Used to be a social event all over. I can remember as a child us getting together once a day. I'm thinking it was on Memorial Day though, and we'd go clean up the cemetery, go clean up all of our family's graves in the cemetery, and there'd be other people out there doing it. In the Cove, it was called Decoration Day, and it was the last Sunday of May. And even to this day, people in the Cove, and yes, it's a national park, and no, nobody lives there anymore, but families of the deceased, the relatives of these families that are buried there, can still come into the Cove and do their honoring and cleaning up the grave. And honestly, those were immaculate cemeteries when I was up there, and as you saw on the tapes. So I hope you enjoyed this. I hope that you enjoyed the cemeteries. I've got some things coming up in the near future I'm going to be posting. So like, subscribe, hit that notification bell, leave a comment. I love reading your comments, so leave a comment. Let me know if there's something that you'd like to see, and if I'm anywhere near it or I need to do some research on it for you, I'll be glad to. I do enjoy this, and I enjoy your company, and I love reading your comments. So see you next time. Uniquely Cindy.